All right, so now we're going to get into the basics, and it's still the basics, but we're going to get into the more of the fun stuff. So let's go ahead one more time, do preferences, initialize ZBrush, and let's go ahead. I'm going to close down all these menus. We don't need to see all that stuff just yet. We've got our tool here. I'm just going to go ahead and start with a cube 3D, drag it out of my document here, go into edit mode. You can hit edit or hit T. If we turn on polyframe, you can kind of see what this cube is made up of. If I want to go ahead and start sculpting on this thing, let's go ahead and say make this a polymesh 3D. So now we can start sculpting on it. By default, you're going to have your standard brush selected, and you're going to click and drag and start sculpting. Now, one thing that's really cool about 3D and 3D programs is when compared to traditional sculpting is, number one, just like when you're in Photoshop, instead of drawing, you got undos. That's super cool. Another thing that's it's a little bit more difficult in traditional sculpting is symmetry. And of course, you don't want to make all of your objects, when you get into character stuff or design, you don't want to make everything perfectly symmetrical, but generally speaking, humans are vaguely symmetrical. So to put an ear on one side of the head and on the other side and making it symmetrical traditionally, it actually takes a little bit of work. In 3D, it's kind of free. So the cool thing about 3D sculpting is you can go up here to your transform, and you can see this activate symmetry. By default, it's going to activate an X symmetry, and I'm going to talk a little bit about X, Y, and Z axes in 3D, but just for now, let's go ahead and turn on our X symmetry, and I don't know if it'll say it or not. Oh, activate symmetry. So the activate symmetry in the X, well, turning on and off activate symmetry is the X hotkey. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to activate. By default, it'll also activate X symmetry. So let's just leave it at that for now. So to activate symmetry on and off, if I hit the X key, it's going to toggle that on and off. So I'm going to be doing that a lot. By default, it's off. If you're in here and you're sculpting, or you have a cursor on here and you're sculpting, you're going to sculpt on one side of your object. If I hit Control Z, that'll undo that. If I tap X, I just toggled X symmetry on. So now when I roll over my object, you're going to see a cursor with a big, that's actually your focal shift. You've got your inside and your outside circle, as well as you can kind of see the cursor kind of following the mesh here, depending on where it's positioned on the object and the plane of that object, the surface normal. And on the other side, you're going to see one dot, and that is telling you that it's activated symmetry in X symmetry. So now if I sculpt, it's going to sculpt both sides symmetrically. And of course, that is in transform, activate symmetry, X symmetry. Because we're going to be talking about a little bit more about symmetry, what I'm going to do is get a little bit tricky here. And I'm going to go over here to the brush menu, and I'm going to go ahead and touch that and just go ahead and get rid of it. I can always bring it back. In fact, if I start up ZBrush again, because I saved that config file, it'll pop right back in there. But for now, what I want to do is take this transform menu, click that circle, drag it over here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about transforms. So, and about X, Y, and Z axes and why that's important to you as a 3D artist. By default, we're sculpting an X symmetry. That basically means it's sculpting across the X axis. So let's illustrate that a little bit. If I go over here to my floor menu, you're going to see I have a floor plane. And by default, if you see these, there's these little bitty numbers in here. Let me turn the floor off so you can make me see them a little bit better. You've got, and Shift P is the floor grid hotkey. So you've got X, Y, and Z. If I turn these all on, so I tap this X and tap the Z, I know if you have bad eyesight, you know these little buttons aren't very hard to see, but they are there. And if you turn on your floor now, you've got X, Y, and Z floor grids. So I'm going to actually turn off X and Z and then just keep Y. So this is your Y floor grid. If you go to the bottom here and zoom in, you're actually going to see, and depending on your resolution, your monitor, and how good your eyeballs are, you're going to see a little red line here. That's your X axis. You're going to see a blue line. That's your Z axis. And your Y-axis is actually, and let's turn on transparency and see if I can't see it. No, because it's only one object. So you just trust me that your Y-axis is there. Let's go ahead and kind of put that on this object. So I'm going to turn my floor off here, and I'm going to hold down Shift and snap it orthographically to this side. And we're going to talk a little bit about resolution and geometry, and then I'm going to talk about the X, Y, and Z axes. So while we're sculpting, and of course we're sculpting an X-axis, so let's say we want to sculpt a face. So I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to smooth these sides down here. I don't want to sculpt on this area up here, because one thing that you want to keep in mind when you're sculpting in ZBrush, and any program really, is that you want nice even quads to make a nice sculptable mesh. You'll see if I turn polyframe off, if I go over here to the sides where everything's nice and even, you're going to have very predictable results. So if I hold down Alt and kind of sculpt in and then kind of sculpt out, you're going to see the results are pretty predictable. As soon as I go over here to the top and it starts getting that pinched area, it does some really zany things. Not really predictable, and probably not what you want. So we're going to discuss how to fix that. But first, let's talk about subdivision. Subdivision resolution. So I turn polyframe back on. You're going to see these are pretty big chunky squares. So let's say I want to sculpt a face. I'm going to hold down Alt. I'm going to dig in the eyes here. Let's sculpt a skull. I'm going to dig in the nose here. I'm holding down Shift, kind of smoothing that top of the cranium back and kind of push these cheeks in and maybe pull this mouth out. And again, we haven't talked about move. We haven't talked about clay brush, any of that stuff yet. So we're just using standard brush. And already it's like, well, that's about as far as I can take this thing. Like I can kind of maybe push this stuff in, but maybe smooth it out. But you know, I'm fairly limited by the resolution of this object already, which is fine. I tell my students, when you're sculpting an organic object, just like a sketch, you want to start low and kind of build up. You don't want to start with poor detail and stuff like that if you don't even know what the object and the form is going to be. So this is actually a good thing. Sculpt in low resolution. So we'll go ahead and knock this back here. Sculpt a little skull here. Sculpt as low as you can while you're working, and this isn't always true for everything, but just in general, organic stuff. Sculpt in lower resolution, and then and only then do you want to raise the resolution of your object. So let's say we want to raise the resolution of this object because we need to make a better looking skull than this. How you're going to do that is go over here to Geometry menu, and you're going to hit this divide button. So now by default you've got SMT, and we're going to get in that later when we start building our base meshes out of ZBrush. But for now, if you hit divide, it looks like it kind of melts your object a little bit, but it also gives you smaller squares. So if you turn on polyframe, then you go in, you're actually going to see there's more squares for you to play with. Now if you drag the slider back and forth, this goes back to the original low poly, and if you go forward, it'll go up to the new high poly. So now if we start sculpting, you can start refining a little bit better where things are going to go. So I'm going to hold down Shift and Smooth. And this is actually going to be kind of difficult without showing you guys some more brushes. So maybe as we move forward, I'm going to kind of introduce you to some new brushes here. So here's our, without the move brush, this is kind of pain. So we've got our skull going here. It's kind of gross. But, you know, just starting on ZBrush just with the standard brush and smooth brush, not too shabby. So let's say, you know what? We need a little bit more resolution. I'm going to hit divide again, and if you roll over this divide key, you're going to see the hotkey for that is Control D. So you can hit D and Control D. So if I hold Control D again, that number is going to change from 3 to 4. I'm going to get even more geometry. If I hit Shift D, that's going to keep our highest resolution but drop it down one resolution. So if I hit Shift D again, that's basically all that's doing is moving this slider around. And then D is going to move up that slider. And then if I hover over divide, of course, Control D is to add another actual subdivision to this object. So I'm going to hit Control Z and just kind of go back to where we just had 3. There we go. So we got our original cube here, and then we got to go up one by hitting D or dragging the slider, and there's our subdivision 2. Here's our subdivision 3. I can go in here with my Alt and then let go of Alt and kind of start sculpting this back, and then hold down Shift to smooth, and we're getting more and more resolution. So that is the basics of resolution and sculpting, and just with the standard brush and just with the smooth brush.